Welcome back to the History with Ali podcast, where we discuss all things history, literature, and media studies. Today, I'm joined by author and journalist Amanda Schiavo. Amanda, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
For having me.
Yeah, could you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Amanda Schiavo. I am a journalist, an author, a historian, a proud Disney Parks girly. I am a dog mom, and I have been an avid horseback rider since the age of 9.
Oh, that's really, really cool. Lots of common interests with me going on there. So, obviously, I can tell by your accent that you are a fellow American. So, how
hmm
did you end up becoming interested
hmm
in the early modern period? Because I'm not sure about you, but it wasn't really taught that much in school, the Tudor dynasty.
Yeah, usually in school, I think from the American perspective is we really just talk about Elizabeth I and then kind of move into colonialism, and that's really it. I first became interested in the Tudor period when I was in middle school. I had to do a report, a women's history report kind of thing. And I had asked my mom, oh, who should I do it on? And everyone was kind of picking the sort of same American women, Abigail Adams, Martha Washington, that kind of stuff. And my mom gave me Carolee Erickson's biography of Mistress Anne, and I was hooked. I was hooked from then, and it just was something that I enjoyed reading about even through high school and then into college. I have a degree in history. I studied history. I did my college thesis on the popular religious experience in England under Mary the First and Edward, and it just was something that I always just really found fascinating. And again, it isn't something that we really talk about here or learn about that in depth here unless it's sort of something you're studying and specializing in college.
That's really neat. So you've been focusing on Mary in that case for quite a
hmm
long time, which we can
hmm
segue over here into your book in her own right. What inspired you to write about Mary? I guess you had researched her before. Was that kind of like
hmm
the spark, or how did it come to be?
I'm a huge fan of historical fiction, especially Tudor fiction. And, when I first sort of started dipping my toe into that world and learning about who the Tudors were, I was very much, I thought like you had to choose a side. If, you had to be Anne Boleyn or Catherine, you had to be Elizabeth or Mary. And, you grow up and you learn different things. And with Mary's story, it always felt like she was somebody you kind of had to get through. You got to get through Mary so we can talk about Elizabeth and how great Elizabeth was. And it kind of felt the same way in the historical fiction world. There wasn't really that many out there where Mary was the main character or where she was sort of portrayed with more balance and nuance. And I was kind of waiting for that. And then I had this, at the time, what felt like a very crazy thought, which was maybe I could write it. Maybe I could write something about Mary, which is a movie. Okay, sorry. So, like, I just like, anyway, I said to myself, maybe I could do it. And I sat down and I started writing. And I remember very vividly, I'm sitting there writing and I'm thinking to myself, I'm never going to finish this, let alone publish it. And now I'm about a little over a month away from the sequel coming out. So it's been really wild. And my ultimate goal with the book is just, and I've had this happen a little bit, is where people say to me, I didn't realize there was more to her than Bloody Mary.
I enjoyed this book for that reason. I think you really humanized her, but you
Thank
were
you.
very balanced. Like, I think no one person is just one thing. And I think you did a
hmm
great job showing all of her personality.
Thank
But of
you.
course, it starts with her relationship with her parents. Could you
hmm
characterize those relationships? And obviously, her relationship, especially with her father, changed dramatically
Mm,
throughout her life. So,
yeah.
what was it like writing from Mary's perspective about her parents?
It was very interesting because as I was writing, I started to feel a little bit of a connection with Mary in her relationship with her parents, in that I had a very difficult relationship with my father. And I mirror that a little bit in how I wrote Mary and Henry, in the sense that there's a scene where and Henry they're having a conversation, and Henry sort of flips on a dime and he just sort of starts yelling at her. And that's something that I was used to, so I kind of knew how to write that, and I put myself in that place as I was writing Mary. And very similarly with her relationship with her mother, I'm very, very close with my mom, and so I put that into it as well. And I think Mary just it sounds so sort of almost cliché, but her relationship with both of her parents, it was so complex. It was so tragic. There were so many different layers to it. Mary, I think the stronger of the two relationships was the one with her mother. And I think that Mary just never got over that trauma of losing her at such a young age, both in a figurative and a literal sense, because they were separated. She was so young when they were separated. She was 17 when Catherine of Aragon died. She had not seen her for quite some time at that point, and it's just something that always stuck with Mary and really framed a lot of her decisions, I think, as queen.
Obviously, there were big changes when Henry fell in love with Anne Boleyn. That
Mhm.
was around the time period where Mary's position was at risk. What do you
Mhm.
think her relationship with Anne was like? And also in the book, something that I really thought was so interesting was Mary considering if Anne had poisoned her mother
Mhm.
and caused her death. And psychologically, that would really mess with you if you think
Mhm.
that you were going to be poisoned. Was their relationship poisoned?
I think so. I think so. One thing actually that's sort of a misrepresentation of Anne Boleyn is how she was horribly cruel to Mary. And, Anne absolutely believed that Mary needed to learn her new place, especially after Elizabeth was born. But Anne Boleyn does try on several occasions to extend an olive branch to Mary, and Mary slaps it away, which I think is honestly very justified. I mean, you're 10, 11, 12, 13 years old. You've been raised from the moment you were born believing, the world is a certain way. And then your father comes in and changes it on what appears to be on the whim of this woman. So I think there was really no room for Mary and Anne to have any kind of a friendship.
So, do you think that the thought of Anne tormented her?
I do. I do think the thought of Anne tormented her. I think also too, Mary needed somebody to blame who wasn't her father. She needed to believe that Henry, because again, and one thing that I had a little bit of trouble with was remembering to write that these are people who truly believed in the existence of God and who truly believed that they were set above by God, that they were almost infallible in a sense, that they were meant to be who they were meant to be. And so for Mary, this is not just her father, this is her king. And I think she needed somebody to blame. So, oh, here comes this witch, this Anne Boleyn, and she is trying to get rid of my mother and take her space on the throne, and my mother's not going down without a fight. And then when the information about Catherine of Aragon's heart comes to light, obviously we know this is most likely some sort of cancer that she died of, but the black spot couldn't have been anything other than poison. So I think for Mary, that gave her even more of a reason to blame Anne. And Anne, I think, really does haunt her for the rest of her life, especially as Elizabeth gets older and Elizabeth becomes sort of who we know her to be, charming, charismatic, quick-witted, that she's very much her mother's daughter. And I think that was something else that haunted Mary.
And she sort of, when she looks at Elizabeth, she doesn't really see her father. She sees
Hmm.
Anne instead. Do you think it was
Yes.
really like that?
I think she definitely saw more of Anne Boleyn in Elizabeth. I think she always looked at Elizabeth as Anne's daughter more than Henry's daughter. And nobody believed that Elizabeth wasn't Henry's, but I think Mary kind of hoped that would be the case. I think Mary, and again, we're not in these people's brains, this is all hypothesis. This is all, what we can assume based on the evidence, but I just think that I think Mary believed it. I think Mary believes Anne capable of all kinds of evil deeds, and I think Mary probably did believe that Elizabeth, there was a high chance that Elizabeth was not truly her sister. And I do play with that a lot in the book. She has a ton of pulling her this way and that way, because that was sort of another thing where she was still her sister, though. She did love this child. She did love Elizabeth. And it just sort of, when it became more about the throne coming between them and religion coming between them, that really just, the relationship just imploded at that point.
Do you think that she felt vindicated after Anne's execution?
I do. I do. I think Mary had a very naive streak. I think she thought, okay, Anne's dead. And now I can go back to court, I can go back to being the princess, and everything's gonna be great, and it's gonna be, back to the way it was when I was a child and everything was perfect. But again, and this also goes, this is another blight on Anne's reputation, that Mary had all this wickedness that happened to her, and all of this abuse happened to her because of Anne. But when Anne dies, Henry pushes at her even harder, and he threatens her life. There's a very traumatic thing that happened to Mary where Henry sends, he's constantly sending people to bully her and threaten her and this and that. There is a moment where someone of Henry's advisors, his name is escaping me at the moment, but he tells her that if I was your father, I'd bash your head against a wall until it was like a baked apple. Just a 17-year-old that this is being told to, 17, 18 years, who's just been through all this trauma. And Mary had to kind of step back and say to herself, crap, he could put me to death. Like this might happen. So she does something that she never forgives herself for, and she acknowledges that she's illegitimate and that her parents were never married, and she sees this as the ultimate betrayal of her mother, I think.
And before we go too far away from it, my favorite scene in the book was when Mary went to see Catherine of Aragon.
Yeah.
And I think that's like the beauty of historical fiction because
Mhm.
I so wish this happened.
Mhm.
It even makes me want to cry thinking
Yeah.
about how they were
Mhm.
separated and then how in the book you were like, she was only an hour away this whole time. Ugh,
Mhm.
that was
That
heartbreaking.
It was so funny because I wanted to be as accurate and to the letter of what actually happened as possible. But as you're writing historical fiction, you keep asking yourself, what if, what if, what if? And I asked myself, what if they got the chance to say goodbye? Even in real life, what if there's a letter that we'll never see because it was burned? You know what I'm saying? Like, what if, what if, what if? And I said to myself, I was like, I wonder how far away these two places actually were. By today's standards, they're a pretty easy train ride from one another. So I thought, okay, if they rode through the night, maybe this is plausible. They'll leave at midnight and they'll get there as soon as the sun's coming up. Maybe this is possible. I did mix a little bit of reality into that because Maria de Salinas, who was Catherine of Aragon's like chief lady in waiting, basically her best friend, does actually go and see Catherine several times, even though she wasn't supposed to have any visitors. And at one point, Maria lies about having the king's sort of seal of approval to go visit, like a physical paper, and she tears out her dress and throws her hood off, and she says, my horse threw me and I lost the paper. And whoever it was at the time that was guarding Catherine just kind of let her in. And so I do that in the scene. I have Maria dress Mary up as a maid, and they park their horses a little bit far away, and she starts messing with Mary's hair and ripping her dress, and Mary's like, what is going on? And she goes, just follow my lead, and that's how they get in. And I just wanted it to I wanted that, like, you know what I mean? I think anyone who knows their story, you just wish they got the chance to say goodbye, if only, if only, if only. And so that's kind of what that was born from. I just wanted it to happen. So in my imagination, in this world that I created, it happened.
And it is possible it did happen. We just don't
Mm,
know about it, as you said. And I feel like if anyone knew how to burn a letter, it was Mary the First.
probably. Yeah.
Because she was smart. She grew
Yes.
up knowing the
Hmm.
game
Yes.
for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
So
She would have known how to cover her tracks, and she had an ally in Chapuis. So.
I love their relationship. I
Hmm.
love his loyalty to her
Hmm.
mother. I think he was almost like not a father figure, but a support.
Hmm. Definitely. Definitely. Hmm.
And then also, I always think it's so funny that he's kind of the voice of the primary source
Yes.
for the
Yes.
Tudor period in general. Like,
Hmm.
it's so funny how its ambassadors were
Hmm.
like learning from. Do you think that she had significant relationships with the stepmothers?
I do. I think she was probably closer to some than others. I think Jane Seymour truly was an ally. Jane was Catholic. Jane had a tremendous amount of respect and loyalty to Catherine of Aragon. And I do think that had Jane lived, she would have promoted Mary's interests a little bit more, especially after having, had the son. And I honestly think she would have done the same for Elizabeth. I don't think Jane held anything against her. That's kind of another sort of popular trope that's popped up, that Jane Seymour hated Elizabeth. She didn't. I think Jane and Mary would have had a close relationship had Jane lived a little bit longer. She does become closer later with Anne of Cleves, because they're not that far apart in age, actually. And so they do become friendly, especially after the divorce. And, Anne is living her best life, and she's at Mary's coronation. When Mary rides into London, Elizabeth is on one side and Anne is on the other. And when Anne passes away, she has her buried in Westminster Abbey. She's giving a funeral that, a queen consort is deserving of. So I think she definitely built a friendship with Anne of Cleves. Catherine Howard being younger than her. Poor Catherine. Poor Catherine. She had enough issues. They had petty disputes between the two of them. It's very tit for tat. To Catherine's point, Mary really wasn't treating her with this respect that the Queen of England deserves. They kind of pick at one another. And then, of course, poor Catherine. With Catherine Parr, yeah, she does have a very good relationship with Catherine Parr. They work on a few scholarly works together. They translate a few scriptures together, and Mary at first wasn't going to publish it under her name, but Catherine convinces her, no, you should do this, and Mary gets a lot of praise for it. The relationship does kind of sour. Mary finds it incredibly disrespectful that Catherine marries so quickly after Henry has died. And so the relationship kind of sours, and I don't really know that they would have patched things up in enough time before Catherine had passed on. I do think there's definitely evidence of her being close with some of her stepmother.
Yeah, which is great because it's almost as if she didn't hold the other women accountable
Mhm.
for Henry's actions,
Yeah.
which is, I think, an example of her being more forgiving
Mhm.
in nature. And as well with Anne of Cleves, the fact that she gave her, as you said, like a royal funeral when she was a
Mhm.
Protestant or a Lutheran.
So Anne of Cleves was not a Protestant in the way that she is depicted a lot of the times in media. She actually does have a Catholic upbringing, and that's really why there's a popular theory or a popular trope that Anne converts to Catholicism after Mary becomes queen, and that's kind of why they become friends. But it's actually she did have a very Catholic upbringing. The Protestants around them and her brother being a Protestant, that was more, I don't want to say political because they were very devout. The brother was a very devout Protestant, and the Germanic states were becoming increasingly more Protestant. But yeah, Anne herself was actually Catholic.
That's really interesting. For some
Mhm.
reason, I did not know that, but that, okay, so it
You
makes
know,
a little bit more sense that
it's something that
they
I
got
I
on.
only maybe a few years ago, because I still thought I was like, "Oh, she became Catholic." But it was really only a few years ago that a few other historians that I were talking to were said, "No, my answer doesn't feel very eloquent." There's definitely people out there who can probably explain it much better than I did, and who are probably listening going, "You don't know what you're talking about." But yeah, no, it was something, it's not something that's taught. The narrative is that she was Protestant and she became Catholic.
Maybe it's because we mix up her being German and them wanting
Could
the
be.
German and
Mhm.
alliance, as
Yeah.
in them wanting the religiously.
Yeah, it wasn't, yeah,
Yeah,
that was the thing, it wasn't really about the religious alliance for Henry. He was isolating himself from France, he was isolating himself from Spain. He needed a powerful ally, and there was the German princes.
that definitely makes sense. Okay, we've learned something. This is what's new. That's the whole point of this whole podcast. So, do you think Mary's health struggles affected her even in her childhood? How genuine do you think her health issues were? Do you think that they were real, or do you think there were times when she would use her sickness so she wouldn't have to go to court sometimes?
Definitely both. I mean,
Yeah.
she definitely, we know that Mary always struggled with menstrual issues, and she also struggled with what we would call today migraines, and also being so young when the Great Matter and acknowledging her illegitimacy when all that happened. I obviously I can't diagnose, but I wouldn't be surprised if she had anxiety, if she had depression, because we know there are stories of her where she wasn't able to, eat for days and things like that. So she definitely had health issues, and then there's, bigger health issues that we can get into when we talk about her as queen. But I do also think that yes, she definitely used it as a tactic when she needed to not go to court. And I think one great example of that is when her brother has died at this point, but she doesn't know that. And she gets a summons to court from her brother, and she just finds it very, very suspicious because they had a falling out. They weren't really speaking, and she just thought it was very strange. And so she goes in the opposite direction, and that's when she learns that he had died. And had she gone to court, the Dudley faction would have nabbed her.
And that was another time where she was showing her strategic mind because
Hmm.
when she got the letter that Edward could be dead, she said to everybody around her, "Don't say anything because this could be
Hmm.
treason." And I thought
Yes,
that
yeah.
that was, she was destined to be queen, I think.
I think so. I do. I
Yeah.
truly, truly think so. And it's so heartbreaking because Catherine believed that with all of her heart. And if she were just allowed to give Mary the education that she needed to be queen. I mean, Mary, I think, does have good examples of female rule in her life because we know that she would have heard stories of Catherine as regent. She would have seen Catherine Parr be regent when Henry was off fighting in France. She would have heard stories of her grandmother being queen regnant in Spain. Even her Aunt Margaret, who was up in Scotland, was regent in Scotland for a period of time. So she had very strong examples of female rule that she had seen. And I think had she just been given the chance, given the education, she could have been a wonderful queen. That's all speculation. I don't think that speculation is a valid argument, but sometimes it can be.
It's interesting too because since Henry was so obsessed with continuing the Tudor dynasty, he acted sort of against that by not marrying his daughters and delegitimizing them. So
Yeah.
they never had the opportunity to have children until
Mhm.
later, which we won't, that's in the next book. But still,
Mhm.
she could have been married sooner. She could have been a
Mhm.
queen somewhere else as well.
Mhm.
Do you think that her being delegitimized kind of turned on like a fire within her?
I think so. I think it definitely did. I think also, I think the majority of Europe didn't buy it. So she was still very much a catch in the political game that was royal marriages. And I think Henry knew that. And I think Henry was afraid of that because anybody she married could have decided, well, I'm going to take the throne in my wife's name and I'm going to overthrow Henry. And we see that even with Henry's father, Henry VII, he waits about a year before he has Elizabeth of York crowned as queen because he didn't want his claim to the throne coming from her because she was Edward's daughter. She was the king's daughter. She was the legitimate heir. If you really want to get into that sort of, that's a whole other argument we could have. But, and I think Henry thought about that too. Somebody very easily could have stepped in and said, I'm taking the throne in my wife's name. Or if Mary had a son, putting his grandson on the throne, you know. So I think Henry had some fear when it came to marriage because she also, you have to remember, she had very powerful cousins. She had the Emperor Charles, who was king of Spain. She had Mary of, I want to say, Flanders, who is another powerful cousin. She had, and then she just had, you know, the people, same people who were supporting Catherine now were supporting Mary with Catherine being gone.
Yeah, it's just wild, like the circles that this goes
Hmm.
into. And you're right. What I think listeners may be surprised about who don't necessarily study this time period is that there are so many strong women rulers.
Hmm.
People always think, 500 years ago, women, they weren't allowed to read. They were more subordinate, but clearly all of those women were very well educated.
Hmm.
It kind
Oh,
of
yes.
did that interest you about the Tudor period, about
Oh,
all women's
absolutely.
history?
Absolutely, absolutely. The 16th century is, you know, there's a lot of female rule across Europe in the 16th century, and I'm sure even other places as well. It's absolutely fascinating that we have this information about these women who did these incredible things. One thing that I think is interesting, a lot of people, more Elizabeth than with Mary, but they tend to place these women in sort of the lens of feminism, and I think that's a mistake because if you look, Mary definitely had more women around her. They didn't have any political positions, but it was sort of known that you kind of had to go through this sort of circle of women if you really wanted to make, you know, an impact with the queen or have the queen listen to you. But I think this sort of modern lens of feminism looking at these women, I think is a mistake because these were people, these were women who believed they were the exception to the rule. Especially when you look at Elizabeth. Elizabeth had a very vicious, jealous streak when it came to other women, and she really believed that she was the exception to the rule. And I think we see that in her very famous speech where she says, "The heart and stomach of a king." And before that, she says, "I have the body of a weak and feeble woman." And I think people look at that as her being coy, like she's being like, "Oh, she's saying women are weak." But no, she believes that. She's saying, "I might have this weakness of being a woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king because I am the exception and I am the exception to this rule." And I think that is really an interesting thought when we kind of cast these women as early feminists, when it's not necessarily the case because they really weren't doing too much to prop up other women.
Very true. And that's another point for Mary because you're right. Elizabeth was so jealous of her
Mhm,
ladies in waiting and would
mhm,
actually, go way out of her way to exile them, to shame
mhm,
them. But Mary seems to be a lot more loyal to those
mhm,
around her. Of course, she's probably, she was in the book, you see the tension with her servants
mhm,
because of the fierceness of her faith.
mhm.
So that kind
Yeah.
of leads me to asking you. So, of course, this book goes up to her being crowned. So
Mhm,
far, I don't believe that she's earned the Bloody Mary moniker. It's
mhm.
not really that part of the book. However, you
Right.
can see things coming
Mhm.
together. So, how do you really feel about Bloody Mary? And do
I
you want to discuss?
absolutely hate that nickname because it's just a classic example of the victors, defining history. Now, that is not to say that Mary does not have blood on her hands. She absolutely does. And we have to hold Mary accountable for the things that she did. And we have to hold Henry accountable for the things that he did, and Edward and Elizabeth. My argument is yes, Mary has blood on her hands. She is no more bloody than the people around her, whether it's members of her own family, whether it's other royals in Europe. It's crazy, but this was normal. This is what they did. This is how they dealt with one another. And for Mary, the burnings were more than just cruelty. This was, I'm going to burn your earthly body because I don't want there to be any relics of you left because you're a heretic and you've done all these terrible things. So we don't want any relics. We don't want anything like that. But also, I'm giving you a taste of hell before you experience this for all eternity. So you can still recant, even in the last possible second. You can say that you recant and you accept the true faith, and your body might be burned, but your soul is in heaven. And for these people living at that time, that was the main goal. Ensuring your afterlife was meant to be the one thing that you constantly focused on throughout your entire life. And again, sitting here in 2026, you think that's the most crazy thing. That's ridiculous. And even some of the religious, so I'm not a religious person at all. Like, and writing some of it and trying to get into that really sort of fanatical mindset was very, very difficult. But this is what they believed. And I think something else too that people have to realize is the people, and not every single one of them, but some of them chose it because they believed that theirs was the true faith. And they believed that, yes, my earthly body is dying, but I'm going to heaven. But I'm the one burning you, and I'm saying you're going to hell, and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And it was just the fervor of, I'm right, God is on my side, I'm going to do this thing. Because we see it a little bit with Jane Grey. Mary did not want to execute this girl. She did not want to execute this girl. She had to. And Jane was fervent in her Protestantism. I am dying for the Protestant cause. That is what I'm doing. Again, sitting here in 2026, you go, wow, I wouldn't have done that. It would have been, yep, yep, I'm Catholic. Can I go home now? Like, whatever you need me to say, girl. It's wild.
And I think Mary had to believe so strongly because there were so many times in her life where all she had was her faith.
Yes.
So how
Mhm.
did you mentioned it was pretty difficult to get in the
Mhm.
mindset of being that religiously fervent, but what
Mhm.
was it like to kind of channel that?
I thought about it like a security blanket Because that's really what it was for her. It was the one constant in her life. It was her security blanket. It was, the teddy bear you've had since you were 4 years old that came with you to college. It was security. So that's really how I had to look at it. And it was hard. You have to take your own self out of it because you look at people who do things in the name of religion today and you're like, oh God, get a grip. I kind of wanted to say that to Mary sometimes too. As I'm writing her, I want to be like, girl, get a grip. But yeah, it just, I think, reframing how I thought about it in terms of more of that security aspect of it. Because it was the one thing that she could cling to no matter where she was in her life. She had that.
What do you think her relationships with Elizabeth and Edward
Mm.
were like?
In the
Because
very
later
beginning,
on, yeah, later
yeah.
once he was king,
Hmm.
especially, yeah.
Yeah, in the beginning, it was very motherly. She loved those children. She truly, truly did. She was godmother at Edward's baptism. She cared very much for Elizabeth. She put money towards her education. When she came back to court in June or the summer of 1536, she tells Henry that she had seen Elizabeth and he would have, great cause to be proud of her. She loved her siblings. She loved her siblings. And one thing Mary wanted very, very much was to be a mother, and she did. She took on that role for them. Edward is an interesting character because he becomes king so young, he dies so young, but he was a very cold individual, a very calculated individual, a very unemotional individual, and it's very, 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 very interesting to see that play out. To us, he was a child, but again, in that time, he was the king, God's choice. Here we go. A lot of the narrative around Edward is he was weak, he was ineffectual, he was a puppet king. But that's not true. We have the evidence of his own journals that he was very strong and he wanted these Protestant reforms pushed through. I think he would have been, again, speculation. I think we'd be talking, I think had he lived, we'd be talking about Bloody Edward, I think. And he was as sure as Mary was that Catholicism was the right path. That's how sure he was that Protestantism was the right path. And Mary contemplates at one point during his reign, do I leave the country? Do I bolt? Do I leave the country? Ultimately, obviously, she decides not to. But that's not for the first time. Her life was in danger because she was openly refusing to follow any new rules. She openly held mass, everything that went with it. Everyone in her household was Catholic, and it caused a lot of friction. Again, as with Elizabeth, the throne and religion came between these siblings. And, with Elizabeth, again, she cared very greatly for her when she was younger. She started to grow up. She started to become more like Anne. She also, she's married. She and Mary were what, 16 years apart? So Mary's getting older, but here's this young, vibrant, young girl coming in again. Again, history is repeating itself. And she could see that Elizabeth was raised Protestant. She was raised in the Church of England. She and Edward were close too at one point. So again, the throne and religion came between them and tore them apart. And Mary had hopes that when she became queen, she could get Elizabeth to convert. It was never going to happen. Elizabeth was always, she was one hell of a chess player, that girl. She could defer and defy and deny and just play the game very well. And ultimately, it works in her favor. But yeah, I mean, at the very beginning of her journey with her siblings, there's just a ton of love there. And at the end, unfortunately, it's fractured and broken and tragic.
Another one of my favorite scenes was when Mary was with Edward and Mary tells him that Queen Jane, his mother,
Mm,
was a Catholic and
mhm,
she would have wanted him to be Catholic.
mhm.
That was a great moment
Yeah.
because it's kind of something I also wish happened.
Mhm,
And his response was that she didn't know what the true religion was.
mhm.
And
I
he
think he
kind
calls
of,
her a foolish woman or something like that. Mhm,
which is so crazy because that's your
mhm.
mother. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
that's
and I
been
think I played with that a lot too because it kind of just goes back to what we know about Edward's character. I honestly wouldn't be surprised if he thought of his mother as a foolish woman because she was Catholic. There's not too much evidence, I don't think, of Edward talking about Jane. It's not necessary. I don't think it's something we think about as much as we were so curious about. Does Elizabeth ever mention Anne? But I don't know how much evidence there is of Edward talking about Jane. But yeah, I mean, and that was another thing going back to the question about the relationship with Mary and her stepmother. Jane was Catholic, so yeah, she and Mary had a good relationship.
Edward was a very cold child. I would
Yes.
say. I've been putting both of his uncles to death.
Yes.
I think that journal entry that you may be
Yes.
referring to,
Where it's just like it's like a sentence. Today, so and so died by the axe, or something like that. Like something very just like matter of fact, almost as if it was like it rained today.
Exactly. Actually, everyone shout out to Janet Wortman because when I interviewed her about her book Puppet King, she said that
Mm,
him writing that was actually very emotional for him.
really?
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Oh, I get it. Like that's like the most he could emote, I guess.
Or
Oh yeah.
something. Great book. Check it out.
Yeah.
So this book, it's very exciting because you're bringing it up to where she has been crowned.
hmm
Do you think that her being crowned to her made everything worth it in
I
the end?
do. I do. And that's I wanted to end the first book there. I was inspired to tell the story in two parts because my favorite historical fiction writer, Alison Weir, she does that with Elizabeth's story. She has the Lady Elizabeth and the Marriage Game. And so it's kind of my like nod to Alison Weir's. I wanted to do it in two parts, but also because I felt that Mary truly deserved that moment of triumph. Everything that she had been through in her life was leading to this moment. She's sitting on the throne, the oils, the crown, the orb, the scepter. She's looking out at these people. You know, she deserved that moment. Everything that happens in her reign happens, but that moment she deserved it. She earned that moment. And that was one of the other reasons that I wanted to stop the first book there.
I've read many books about Mary, and I don't think if this peak didn't happen, I don't think I would be reading so many books about her
Mm-hmm.
because it would be very depressing.
Mm-hmm.
So this obviously does leave off on a hopeful note, not for Jane Grey,
Not
but
for Jane Grey.
as you
No.
said, Mary was giving her the opportunity
Mm-hmm.
to repent and she did
Yes,
not.
yes, because she didn't think she needed to, and that was the thing, and actually in the sequel, which is called Fire and Faith, and that'll be out May 7th, we get a chapter from Jane's perspective, Jane in the Tower.
I was about to ask, what can we look forward to? So that is something very much
Mhm.
to look forward to. And then, of
Yes.
course, I assume that you're going to cover Mary's queenship, maybe?
Yes, we'll go into her queenship. We'll go into we're actually going to get a little nitty gritty because we're going to go into some of her council meetings because another thing that I wanted to do was highlight some of the things that Mary did. Mary laid a lot of the groundwork that led to the success of Elizabeth's reign. She started to sort of reorganize the country's finances and she was opening up trade to different places and she was passing these different acts that impacted trade and craftsmanship at home to sort of boost the economy that way and get people more money, more jobs. There was the Weavers Act, all these different kinds of trade acts that benefited these people. And she passed reforms. She invested in hospitals. She really, really, really laid a lot of groundwork. And again, it's something that's just sort of glossed over because there's the popular mind, there's nothing more to her than Bloody Mary. So I got a little nitty gritty with some of the council meetings. And I don't want that to deter anybody. I promise. It's not just like page after page of like, on the agenda today. It just was meant to be. Hey, she did some great things as queen. She made some mistakes. She made a lot of mistakes. One of those mistakes being her husband, and I hated him. I hated writing him. I was like, how much do I want to change the history? Just kill him off.
It's funny because I was about to mention Philip. I
Yeah.
can't wait to see your take on
Oh.
that because we get mixed messages about how much she
Mm-hmm.
loved him and
Mm-hmm.
then everything else that happened.
Yeah.
Well, this has been so great. Could you tell our listeners where to find you on the interwebs?
Yes, absolutely. So you can find me on Instagram and social media. It's at Amanda Schiavo Author. And if you go to the link in my bio, you can find In Her Own Right. And also Fire and Faith is available for pre-order.
Awesome. So I love on your Instagram that
Mhm.
you will often dress as Mary
Yes.
and do different TikToks and stuff. I love that.
Yes.
First, has
Thank you.
anyone ever told you that you might look like what Angelin might look like?
I have heard that a few times and I love it.
When I first clicked on your profile before I knew you, I definitely was like, oh, that's Anne. She's doing Anne. And then you click on and it's Mary. So that's really cool that you do that. Is that a way that you've learned to connect with a wider, the Tudorverse?
Yeah, it brought me a little bit of a wider audience, and honestly, it was just fun. So I can't even take credit. The idea is not even mine. I connected with these wonderful women on TikTok. TikTok can truly be a wonderful place. I have made so many history friends in that space. I connected with these two wonderful women, one of whom was doing Anne Boleyn cosplay, another who was doing Mary Boleyn cosplay, and they both said, "Do this, do this, do this." And I thought, "Oh, I don't know." And I started doing it, and it's so much fun. And I have another friend, AJ. She does a ton of Tudor content, a ton of Tudor cosplay. She's amazing. And it just ended up being really fun. I get very frustrated with social media because it's very much like I'll have like hits of like one video will get like 16,000 views and another video will get like 6 views. I have a very like love-hate relationship with social media. I have taken a little break from the cosplay, but I might get back into it. I might get back into it. But yeah, it's just a sort of fun, silly thing that opened up my world a little bit more, and I met amazing people because of it.
Oh yeah, and also you've gotten the chance to go to England and interact with the history community, right? Because I
Yeah.
see them from afar and I'm so jelly that they have history events all the time. What was
Me
it going over there? I guess meeting some of your favorite historians and becoming
Yeah.
actual friends with them.
Such a cool experience. Such a cool experience. Oh my goodness. I love London as a city. I've been several times even before the sort of journey with the book. And yeah, I get to meet I it feels kind of surreal. It's sort of like you guys are the real historians and I'm just over here, but it's like no, I'm a real historian too when I put my foot down. And it's just so it sounds so cliche, but it's just so cool. It's just so cool. And the history community is so lovely and so supportive, especially the women in the history community. We're all looking out for one another. And it's just been such a lovely, lovely experience.
Yeah, we're very, very lucky
Yes.
on our in the Tudor community. You're right. There's so
Mhm.
many amazing women, and we've got
Mhm.
some like amazing male historians who are total
Yes,
allies, which I love.
absolutely.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. This was great.
Thanks for listening to the History with Ali podcast. You can find me on Instagram, YouTube, and Spotify at History with Ali. See you next time.